kind of the introduction to evangelism, that our engagements should look more like diplomacy than D-Day, and the thought there is that there should be there is a distinct way to engage people that runs counter to popular society. And I gave you some examples there of how the sports and the political realm operates, and how people are seeking to embarrass those who disagree with them, and those are not effective ways of doing evangelism. Although I did read this, and I think there's some extent to which it is true. In a formal debate situation, it is sometimes a good tactic to show. It's always a good tactic to show the foolishness of your opponent's position. In other words, you're trying to show how ridiculous a position is. And there's a sense in which there should be a shame or an embarrassment on that person. But the point is not to shame that individual. The point is to show other people who are sympathetic with that position how ridiculous that position is. And so there is a caveat to this. But what we're talking about is, most of us are not going to be involved in a public debate. We're not going to be involved in some type of public discussion where there are people who are gathered to hear us speak to somebody else. But there is a place. There is a place for that. And I'll just give you an example. When Elijah was gathered against the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18. And they cried out all morning for Baal to answer them, and obviously Baal did not answer them. And by the time it came noontime, that they began to cut themselves with knives and literally shed their own blood to get Baal to answer them. And the Bible says Elijah mocked them. He mocked them, openly mocked them. And one of the lines, if it's translated accurately, is that said, you need to cry louder because perhaps he is asleep. And the next line is, or maybe he's in the toilet. Maybe he's in the toilet. In other words, maybe he's gone off to go to the bathroom somewhere, and he can't hear you calling. Now, what was that designed to do? That was designed to show the children of Israel, who were witnesses to this entire thing, that these guys are serving a God who cannot hear them no matter what they do. And so there is a place for that type of engagement. But normally that's not the way we ought to handle our business, either in private or in public. And then we close by noting how important it is to worry about gardening more than harvesting. We need to be more concerned with gardening than harvesting. Most of I'm just speaking from my experience of being associated with the churches of Christ my entire life. All right? So, I'm speaking from somebody who's got a little bit of history with the churches of Christ. And our mindset with regard to evangelism and missions is always, how many people did you baptize? How many people did you baptize? How many people did you baptize? And that's completely counter to what we're told to do. We're told to go and teach. That's why Paul said, the Lord did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Now, Paul didn't say that because baptism is not important, or that baptism has no connection whatsoever to being saved. He said, my job is not to baptize people. My job is to teach people, and it's their job to believe what I'm teaching and be baptized. That's go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes, or every all creation, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. My responsibility is in verse 15, and the hearer's responsibility is found in verse 16. And so that's why I've always been a fairly strong supporter of house to house, heart to heart. We probably have a handful of members, or have had a handful of members, or people to obey the gospel directly because of that paper. We've probably sent by now, and by the way, this is not a preacher count. Okay, this is an actual count. Since we started sending out house to house in 1999, we have mailed out over 1 million copies of that paper. 1 million. And the vast majority of that 1 million copies has been in Marion County. And we've done some mailing for the church. We did some mailing for a while to the church in Pahrump, Nevada. A little group of about a dozen Christians out there. We did a mailing for them. We did a mailing for some time for the church in Sullivan when they hired, I can't remember, the brother who passed away of cancer. I think he left South Haleville and went down there, and we were helping the church at Sullivan. We mailed for them. We mailed for the church in Jonesboro, Tennessee, over in Far East Tennessee. We've done mailings in other places, but the vast majority of that 1 million copies was right here in Marion County. And then the vast majority of that majority has been within a 10-mile radius of this building. So we've literally saturated this area with good Bible teaching. But it's still not a substitute for what we do individually. But my point is, I've been a supporter of house to house because our job is to teach people. Mailing house to house is not a substitute for what I'm supposed to do as an individual. But every single household within a 10-mile radius of this building has received probably hundreds of copies of house to house, heart to heart. Hundreds. Now I know there's one somewhere up on P Ridge that hasn't had hundreds because he wrote an anonymous letter threatening to kill me if we didn't stop sending it. Problem was he didn't include the address we were supposed to strike from the mailing, so he just kept on getting it. So apparently he wasn't serious about killing me. Glad for that. But we've done a good job in a lot of ways of teaching. We had the TV program. When the TV station was on the local cable and over the air. And so our job is to teach. Our work in Ghana is very important. Not because when I made 14 trips to Ghana we baptized a ton of people, because we didn't. Because our work was to help train preachers to go do their work. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that literally thousands and thousands of people have been baptized through the work of those men that we helped train in Ghana. And again, when I say literally thousands and thousands, I'm being dead serious. I'm being dead serious. That's not an exaggeration. We've graduated 200 preachers from that place in the last 25 years. And you think about how many people have obeyed the gospel out in that nation out of the work just out of our preachers, and then others that they're teaching. And so we want to think about evangelism in terms of gardening as opposed to harvest. All right? We want to be good gardeners. And then at the top, where it says, where do I start? I'm not going to run through all these again, but I think it's important, that there has to be a body of knowledge. Every Christian ought to have a body of knowledge about basic Bible doctrines. You don't have to know every verse in the Bible about any particular subject, but there's only about, for example, on this list, there's only seven things on this list. All right, and if I was going to add one to this list and turn it into 8, I would add premillennialism to that list. And you just need a handful of verses in your head at the ready to deal with 7 or 8 issues that are going to come up in any discussion. We could, or if we want to go 9, we could use instrument. We could add instrumental music to that, or we could add male leadership to that, or we could add the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. Now we're up to 11, but you're still only talking about a dozen or so verses in your head. That you have it on instant to recall. All right, and so. I always refer to these as my go-to verses, and this has been in the past a pretty popular concept. I've taught it a number of times at Polishing the Pulpit and in other gospel meetings and other types of engagements, seminars, especially evangelistic seminars, and I endorse this method for every single Christian. Is to have at least have one verse on, say, a dozen or so issues that might come up. Now, what I call my go-to verse on the subject of baptism is always Romans 6:3-5. Always Romans 6:3-5. And there's a reason for that. Now, I know that Mark 16 is on your handout there, but the reason I use Romans 6:3-5 is it's, number one, it's irrefutable. But number 2, it's not a verse that our denominational friends have conjured up some type of objection to. For example, Mark 16:16 is here on this text. Scratch that off. Don't use it. Don't use it. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved, and he who does not believe shall be condemned. And I'll just say, there's a dumb argument against from Mark 16:16. They say, well, it doesn't say he who believes not and is baptized not. That's the argument. I've heard it 1,000 times. It doesn't say he who believes not and is baptized not shall be condemned, which is just dumb. What does the verse say that a person has to do to be saved? Tell me what the verse says. It says, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. It doesn't have to say anything else beyond that about who is lost, because it tells me exactly who is saved. Right? And so the verse tells me, but they've conjured up this dumb idea that because baptism's not in the second half of the verse, that it somehow negates baptism in the first half of the verse. Then you have Acts 2:38. Repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of sins. Our denominational friends say for means because of, like you go to prison for murder, because you've already committed murder. Again, that denies the language of the text. But I'm telling you these things so that if you're going to use one verse, use Romans 6. Because there's no foolish argument that's been conjured up against Romans 6. Know ye not that so many of us, as were baptized into Jesus Christ, were baptized into his death? Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we've been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. You see there? There is no being raised in newness of life without being baptized. Nobody can be raised in newness of life without being baptized. When we're buried, then we are raised in newness of life. But our denominational friends teach that you have newness of life and then somehow you're buried. It doesn't work. But verse 5, I think, is also a critical verse. If we've been planted together in the likeness of his death. That is a phrase that describes baptism. That's what baptism is. Baptism is being planted in the likeness of his death. It says, if we've been planted together in the likeness of his death, then we'll also be in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that Christ is raised from the dead to die no more. The old man of sin has been destroyed. But here's my point. The denominational world says you can be in the likeness of his resurrection without being in the likeness of his death. But that's not what Paul says. And so Romans 6, 3-5 is my go-to. That's my go-to on baptism. And I'm not going to spend any more time on it. I'm just explaining to you how these things work. That's really the only verse that you need to teach about baptism. It really is. And when I say teach about it, I mean put a seed in the mind of the individual that you're talking to. We've talked about putting a rock in somebody's shoe in the past. This book here that I mentioned in the book by Cowpel on tactics talks about putting a rock in somebody's shoe. It's not that you have to teach somebody everything in one sitting, but you give them something to think about that they can't let go of, that they can't get out of their mind. And by the way, even though I told you don't use Mark 16:16, I did use it a few months ago with an individual who was talking to me. We were standing right here in the front of the building, and the statement was made that you didn't have to be baptized to be saved. And I just said, please read. I said, just read Mark 16:16. And I said, read it out loud. And when the individual read the verse out loud, he stumbled at it because it didn't make any sense to him. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. I mean, that's exactly how that reading went. He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Never occurred to him that was the case. And so, in that particular instance, Mark 16:16 served the purpose, that I needed it to serve. But having that go-to verse, look, I think I forgot to send. I put it on Facebook. I meant to send it out this morning. I got distracted. Part of our 40 days of prayer. One of the things that we can do as a part of that is spend 5 minutes every day studying one of those things. 5 minutes a day. Maybe I'll add that to a separate light post. Here's your go-to verse on baptism. Here's your go-to verse on miracles. Here's your go-to verse on the 10 Commandments. Here's your go-to verse on instrumental music. Maybe I'll add that to the daily thing. But spend a little bit of time every day, going through these, and don't let me forget to, like I said, I posted the day of prayer this morning, but then I thought, man, it is too early for me to post this and send it on a light post because some of y'all are still asleep. And so I didn't want to make you angry with the 40 days. That'd be a bad way to start your day, to get angry over a 40 days of prayer text, wouldn't it? So then I got busy and then forgot to send it. But I will get it out. All right, now under number 2 is, in addition to knowledge, there has to be wisdom. Because there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about the Bible, but they don't have any wisdom in how they exercise their knowledge. The Bible says knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. That's what Paul talked about in matters of conscience. You may know that this thing is okay to do, but you need to let love override what you know in order, for the benefit of your brother. But that's also true in evangelism. We can know a lot of things, but we have to know how to put those things together in a way that that helps the hearer Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer every man. Not what to answer every man, how to answer every man. That's Colossians 4 and about verse number 2. I don't even know if it's on your handout or not. It's not. But write that down. Colossians 4:2. Let your speech be with grace, seasoned with salt. What's that? What does salt make? What does salt do? What does it do? It preserves, but what else? You don't put salt on your hamburger to preserve it. It makes it taste better. That's right. Salt is that thing that makes food taste bad when it's not on it. I'll give you a second to process that one. Let your speech be seasoned with salt, so that you might know how you ought to answer every man. Not what. For the Christian, the what should be right there, right? If we're diligent students and we're studying, we're putting these things, these 10 or 12 things into practice and printing them in our minds. So the what should be right there. The how is the kicker, right? Because 3 different people can all ask you the same question, but they don't all deserve the exact same answer, do they? Is that right? They don't all deserve the exact same answer. Sometimes the what needs to be weighed out, but in every case the how needs to be weighed out. Now there's a danger here. There's a danger here, and I'm going to share it with you, is that sometimes we can misinterpret people's motives when they ask questions, right? Let me ask you a question. If you've been married more than 5 minutes, you've misinterpreted your spouse's motive in asking you a question. And the what was easy to say, but the how was a big mistake. Is that right? Shake or nod? Yes. All right. Yes. The how is important. It requires wisdom. It requires discernment. And by the way, always err on the side of honesty. Now, when somebody asks a question, always err on the side of integrity and honesty behind on the part of the inquisitor. Now, there are some times when you know why the question is being asked, the intent behind it, or the statement that is made. And how would you know that? Well, by experience. Maybe you have experience with this individual, and you know that they're only asking in order to be provocative. You don't answer that person who you assume is asking in sincerity. There used to be this is back in the earliest days of email, and there used to be these email groups and like mail lists and like there'd be, let's just say there might be 50 or 100, some of them that I was involved, might be 50 or 100 preachers involved. And we'd all be studying something, right? And we would, ask questions back and forth, posit questions. There was one guy, and I'm not going to name him, but there was one guy who was always playing the devil's advocate, pushing the envelope. You could count on him every time. Count on him every single time. And then here's what he would do. He'd say something just really outlandish and put it out there in the group. And then, when the backlash came, he's like, "Oh, well, I didn't really just mean that. I was just saying that. I didn't say I believed that. I'm just saying that." the writer of Proverbs has the Proverbs has a passage that talks about people who do that. They're dangerous and they're fools. The man who jests and says, "I'm only," if you depend on your rendering, the man who says things and then backs up and says, "I was only kidding." Look it up. Look it up in the Proverbs. The Bible has the Bible says, don't give any space to people like that. That just want to be, envelope pushers. That just want to always be the devil's advocate. Those people are dangerous. They're dangerous. Because he's only going to back up when he gets enough pushback. The truth of the matter is, there's probably a really good chance that he's lying when he says he doesn't believe what when he gets enough pushback. There's a really good chance he's lying when he said, "I really don't believe this." Look, I would never say anything that I didn't believe. I would never promote anything that I didn't believe. If you see me post something online that you like, does he really believe that? There's probably going to be some face emoji that's going to say, "Hey, this is obviously sarcasm," right? Because I don't want anybody to misunderstand me about anything. But a lot of times I might say things in jest, but I'm going to make sure. Sometimes there might be a parenthetical state or a parenthetical word at the end that says sarcasm. No, just so that you understand, I really don't believe this. I'm going to let you know, sarcasm. So, but we want to be people who have wisdom and discernment when we're talking to people. And in number 2, it talks about an artful method. An artful method. Wisdom and artful method. And in Calkel's book, Tactics, he talks about being on vacation. I believe it's up in the Upper Peninsula, and he's at a little old store. I think this is how old it was. I think he was getting some film developed. That give you an idea how long ago that encounter was. And he's picking up some film that he had developed, and he's talking to a woman at the cash register, a young woman at the cash register, and she's wearing a pentagram. Y'all know what a pentagram is? It's an upside down 5-pointed star, upside down inside of a circle. If you grew up in my generation, all rock bands had some kind of pentagram somewhere on every album cover. It was to be provocative. It's associated with the occult. All right? And so this woman's wearing this pendant with a pentagram on it. And Calkel just asked a very innocent question. He said, "I noticed that pendant that you're wearing around your neck." He says, "Are you wearing it because you like it, or are you wearing it because it has some kind of meaning?" That's pretty innocent, isn't it? And she says, "I'm wearing it because it has a meaning." She says, "I'm a Wiccan. We respect all life." That's what she said. "I'm a Wiccan. We respect all life." And if you don't know what a Wiccan is, it's the newest word for witch. And now they don't use Wiccans, they use the term pagan. I'm a pagan. So she says, "I'm a Wiccan. We respect all life." Now that was her, and so he just says, "That's interesting." He said, "Now, since you respect all life, may I assume that you are pro-life?" And she says, "Oh no, I'm pro-choice, but I could never kill a baby." Now, think about what she said. First thing she said is, "I respect all life." And then just with a very simple question, so if you respect all life, are you pro-life? So then she had to admit she's really not. She really doesn't respect all life. And then what else did she admit? That she understands that abortion is killing a baby. Right? Now look, he didn't have to drag any of that information out of her, did he? He didn't have to drag out, "I respect all life." She offered that. He asked a very innocent question in follow-up. He didn't have to drag out that she believes that abortion is okay, but that it's also killing a baby. Just very simple, to the point questions that are, nobody in her position would ever be offended by receiving those questions, right? But he asked the right question at the right time and then responded by asking another question. So, and if you read the book, and I highly recommend that you do, he began to ask, he just kept asking a series of questions. About, well, then when is it okay to kill a baby? When is it not okay to kill a baby? And so when he walked off, she wasn't angry with him. But when he walked off, he had given her something to think about, hadn't he? I said I respect all life, but I really don't respect all life. Because I think it's okay to kill babies. I would never kill a baby, but I think it's okay for somebody else to kill a baby. So what did he do? He put something in her mind that's not going to be easily dismissed, is it? It's not going to be easily dismissed. All right? And so, we want to be able to engage with people on that level. On that level. There's an artful method. And then at the bottom, and we'll stop here after 2b. Jesus had an artful method about it, right? For example, in Matthew 21, 23 to 27, by what authority do you do these things, and who gave you that authority? That was the question that was asked. By what authority do you do these things, and who gave you the authority? In other words, by their question, they presented themselves as experts in authority, right? They presented themselves as experts in authority. So then Jesus says, I will ask you a question, and if you answer my question, I will answer your question. So they said, fair enough. He said, the baptism of John, where did it come from? Heaven or men? That's a question about authority, isn't it? Did the authority for John's baptism come from God, or did John's baptism come from men? So they gathered off to the side and said, if we say from heaven, he's going to ask us why we didn't obey it. And if we say from men, we're liable to get stoned because everybody here believes that John is a prophet or was a prophet. So they walked back and they said, well, we can't tell you. We can't say. We're unsure. So what did they do? In their answer, by their answer to refuse to answer about authority, they showed themselves as incapable of asking the question that they asked Jesus to begin with. Now, if you can't answer my question about authority, then what gives you the right to question me about my authority? Do you see how simple it was? Jesus didn't get angry. Jesus didn't lash out at those guys. He just said, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. And and we can think about, and by the way, this does take some time to think about. I wish Big Boy was here this morning, because I know, because of the exchanges that he and I have, I know that he sits around thinking about what he's going to say the next time he hears something. And that's really, it's really important. He knows what he's going to say. The next time somebody says something to him about baptism not being necessary, or being saved by faith only, or once saved, always saved, you know what? Big Boy got an answer. And not just because Big Boy's sharp, which he is, but because he spent some time thinking about it. He's been thinking about, even during all this in the last 2 days, guess what he and I have been doing? We've been going back and forth talking about specific false doctrines and various verses that are used. I know he's thinking about those things. He's ready. That joker's ready. You're not going to get him. You're not going to get him. And we need to spend more time in those types of self-evaluating, self-discerning situations. Look, because most times you know who you're going to come in contact with, right? You're going to come in contact with the same people day after day at work, day after day at school. Is that first or second? Okay. Day after day at school. Day after day in at your kids' ball games. So being prepared for potential conversations is something that we all need to be mindful of. All right. Next week we'll start top of right hand column. Top of the right hand column. By the way, I have a short book ordered for this class when we finish this particular sheet, but they're not due to be delivered until tomorrow. So I'll get them handed out, Lord willing, next Sunday and get us ready to go. Romans 12, 4 and 5.